Hey everybody, and welcome back to another scenario playthrough. This is the last one in the original game series. This is scenario number 21, Thunder Rock. We've got to get 900 guests in our park by the end of year 4, with a park rating of at least 600. On the surface, that's not too hard, but we have this sort of unique, interesting terrain. And this brings up kind of one of our first conundrums of this build series, where we've been trying to go for more realistic stuff, but we're presented with a landscape that's sort of inherently unrealistic to have a theme park plopped on top of. There's a lot of different solutions that we can do here. When Andrew at Mickey Man's RCT station did his a while back, he built everything off of the mountain and went through it very little as well. So that was a pretty interesting solution and a pretty clever way to go about it. What I thought I would do is sort of go into the, semi-realism type of design where we are going to build on top, but we're going to do some landscape modifications to smooth this out a little bit. And when I say landscape modifications, I mean we're going to pretty much rebuild the whole mountain. So, buckle up because it's a long one. Today and the next episode are both going to be fairly hefty. Now, the intention for what I wanted to do changed throughout. Initially, I wanted to have this kind of water feature up top that had like a lake, and then it worked its way down to the front where we'd have this big waterfall off of the cliff, and then like a semicircular kind of pathway that went up and around the waterfall up to the actual cliff. As we built further, we realized that just didn't really work out, so it was a bit of a change kind of as we went through. And the other challenge we had here is, of course, there's the interest in still building and doing kind of our general aesthetic build that we want to do and get that right kind of look and feel at the end. But of course, we've also got to win the scenarios. So we're also having to pay attention to the guest count throughout the whole thing, which again, 900 isn't too bad, but it's still something we got to think about. So we're going to get started with just a couple of various little flat rides and things, and then I did this junior Boomerang coaster from Vekoma. Figured this would be a good way just to get us going a little bit, get some money going in, but obviously we need a larger coaster to really get going further, but we'll get into that in a little bit. This one was a bit challenging. I was trying to kind of replicate some of the standard layouts that Vekoma uses for this size of ride, but they weren't really working out at the moment, so we tried a couple of different things here, and all told, we kind of ended up with this sort of figure 8-ish design with 2 parallel lift hill and return hill, which in general I kind of like the look of, kind of works well. The challenge we ran into initially was that the track was right up against the station, so we couldn't put an entrance or an exit on the side facing the rest of the coaster, and I don't like to, if possible, keep our entrance and exit on the same side, so ideally we have something on each side. So that was the goal. There was a little bit too ambitious there with the turnaround spikes. We had to make it just a little bit longer. But there we go. And now we've got a layout that I will still extend just a little bit more because we certainly don't want the thing to crash once we get the peeps on it. That's one of the things to pay attention to when you're building. If you have a ride that has a shuttle mode like this that's very, very close to the end, remember the peeps add weight. So your train will travel just a little bit further, and you got to watch out for that just so you don't end up crashing it once you get all the peeps on it. So as we go through, we're unlocking a lot of the flat rides just because that seems like the right thing to do. And at this point, it's still sort of trying to figure out what the plan is. I tend to go into these scenarios with maybe a vague idea, but on the whole, I really don't go into these with a huge detailed plan about what we want to do. So this one I had some kind of vague ideas, but for the most part I didn't. So it was one of these things where as we built is as we were kind of figuring it out and going along. But here's kind of our first big move, I would say, as we start to try and figure out what's going on in here. And that would be to do a sky ride that has just a straight section like this. So the sky ride that is given to us with the scenario start, I don't love because it's not super realistic. So this type of sky ride, you can't have turns on. In order to do that, you'd really have to come down, disengage the chairlift car from the cable. All this type of chairlift car doesn't disengage. So either way, it's really just not a super realistic design to have this with all these curves into it. So we're going to try and simplify that. Now, right now, this thing goes right up through the middle of the mountain, and you can see we're putting a second one here side by side just because I kind of wanted the capacity for it and the overall look. Kind of in my head was the old Ghost Hunt in the Sky Park that was in North Carolina, where we had a couple of different funiculars that went up and also a sky ride that went to the top. So that was sort of the idea here initially. And of course, right now they go through the mountain in a tunnel, and that's not the intention. And eventually what I'd like to do is make that into one big canyon and then sort of split our rock into two pieces, I guess. And on the one side we have sort of a smaller bit, and then we have the canyon down the middle, and then we have the larger rock on kind of the main side there. So that's the idea here, and we're basically trying to get set up for it. So we'll go ahead and get those in so we can get them operating, and then we'll come back to it here in a little bit and try to do some of those changes. The big challenge here, since we're rebuilding the entire mountain pretty nearly, is finding enough money to do it. And that tends to be the big challenge always on these sorts of things. This one family coaster isn't going to do it, even though it does start to get some money through. Now, a couple of those throw rides are going to be decent, but on the whole, we need a big coaster to get started. So playing around with a wooden coaster here just to kind of see what we want to do. Obviously, there's the easy option to use the cliff for some kind of a large drop. So, of course, that's what we want our main rides to be doing. And in the end, both of our big coasters that we're going to build will use the cliff to their advantage. But then also trying to just take advantage of views and things like that. So put this Ferris wheel right up against the cliff. But sort of as a spoiler alert, pretty much every one of these attractions that's here right now, except for those two sky rides, is going to move. And it may move once, it may move twice, it may move even more than that. But that's kind of sort of how we're having to deal with this right now, where we need to beat the stage and get our scenario win. But at the same time, we also want to get our kind of final look and feel. But we're sort of figuring that out as we go, and it's really predicated on a couple of different things. So part of this is this kind of build stands in as sort of a temporary start, and then we'll go from this to something a little more permanent as we get going a little further. So, as part of that, I'm just kind of sticking in a number of these little bits and pieces. And here's where we try to bring in our little piece of river that is going to go off the edge and have a big waterfall down. So that's, at the moment, that was the idea, but it's not really going to work out that way. But we will still keep the water, because I do think that there is a decent argument to have water in pretty much all of your builds, unless there's a really thematic reason why you shouldn't. Water is just a great way to organize your park. So here we are looking at a couple of different options for coasters to fit in. So I did think for a while maybe we could do a shuttle coaster like an Arrow launch loop, but as it turns out, those things are gigantic, and it would stretch a little bit further than either of the kind of east, west, or north, south for this rock, so we're going to avoid that one. Also looked at maybe a Boomerang option with the corkscrew coaster, but that one didn't really work out either. So for now, we're going to stick with our Junior and get ready to build a larger one here in a little bit. But in the meantime, I want to continue to build our river out just a little bit. So we kept this sort of natural mountain on the corner here, or next to the return spike for the coaster. So I want to use that, because really when you think about this, the top of this rock really is sort of its own terrain in itself, so it's got a pretty good undulation, so we want to take advantage of that as best as we can. And what I think I want to do here is have this kind of main viewing spot up here that has some kind of ride with a nice visual, and then we have our kind of nice windy pathway down along the hillside here. We can make that sort of nice with grass and some plants and things like that, because there's no reason why this has to stay dirt the whole way around. I want to make it at least a little bit brighter and more colorful here. Also changing this up a little bit in this instance to do the pathway that's on the ground gets the cobblestone, the pathway that's up in the air gets the dirt, which is sort of a stand-in for like wood plank. So that's the strategy, at least initially here, as you go through it. And starting to try and figure out what these different views are going to look like, and then kind of see what kind of space we've got left over to build stuff. So that's how we start coming through here with some of these pathways. And you can kind of see it just forming its way up a little bit here and creating some of these seating areas and places for the guests to gather. So we're getting a little bit closer here. You can see that bridge. Went ahead and built the bridge before we built the water underneath of it because I knew what I wanted to do with it, and I knew the general height that I wanted to put it on. So it was sort of a stand-in there until we got the funds to go ahead and do the rest of it. And now we'll do a little bit of waterfall work here at the far end. Now, since you don't have the moving water in the original game, the way that it's kind of always been done, I suppose, is just using the ice texture on the edge of the tile to sort of simulate that waterfall element. So that's what we're going to do here. And we can do that in a couple of different spots here to create a bit of a cascade effect and work our way up to this little water feature. And what I liked about this water feature is that from the bridge you'd get a nice view of kind of this whole thing going on. So kind of a bit of calm, I guess, in the middle of this whole big theme park. Now, by the end of this build on the next episode, you're going to see that waterfall is still there, just or actually I don't even know if it's still there now that I think about it, but we definitely squeezed a lot more in just because it's sort of eye-opening about how little space you have here, especially when you're building in the scale that we do for some of these coasters. Speaking of coasters, here is our first big one. So the idea is vertical drop coaster, which I'm sure you could have guessed from the very beginning of the scenario because, big cliff and the one ride that's centered around big drops off of big cliffs. Well, of course, we have this one here. So the idea is trying to figure out what we want to do with it. Now, once again, we really don't have the option to do too much with it since we don't have any kind of major elements for it. So we got the little loop, which isn't really realistic to begin with. The only dive coaster that's got a loop in real life is Yukon Striker up at Canada's Wonderland, and that one's a pretty big loop. So we're really not going to be able to do anything with that, and we don't have anything else like dive loops or Immelman or any of the other kind of elements that you would typically have. So once again, we basically just riff off of Oblivion and G5, the original two dive coasters, and see how they fit into our scheme here. So basically what I'm doing is creating a pretty large drop here, and I put a station there just to test it initially. Obviously we're going to come back through and build ourselves a lift hill and everything, but the idea is we have this nice big drop, then we have a climb up, and then we just got to get it back to the station. So right now I'm kind of moving things around in order to get there. We've got a little bit of pacing consideration that we need to look into because that second half there after we climb back up on top of the cliff is going to be fairly slow, but we don't want it to crawl. So I want to make sure that it stays low enough but not too low that we have to bury it in a bunch of tunnels. So again, once again, you see this whole thing in a tunnel, but obviously with the thought process of carving out a chasm for those sky rides, in my head I know that that's going to eventually all be outdoors, or most of it out from the cover. So just trying to think through it while we build and kind of get in my head what this is going to look like before we actually build it. Looked at maybe a steep slope lift or a shallow lift hill, and then ended up with a steep lift hill on this. Steep turns out to be a little bit better looking, in my opinion, for dive coasters, just because you have the vertical drop on the drop side. So if you do the shallow lift on the dive coaster, it just looks a little bit funny, maybe almost too shallow. And then if you do the steep lift, I think it generally looks better. And as an added bonus, you can fit it into a much smaller area. So that's what we did here. Give ourselves a little tiny station, and then also allow us to build in a brake run here so we can run multiple trains. We'll try and get 3 trains in the end in a 3 car arrangement. That will let us keep the throughput going here. And the hope is that we can charge quite a lot of money for this and really use this to fund our excavation process that we're going to be doing here. So there we are. We've got the coaster open. We got it ready to go. We don't need a huge queue either because this thing has such high capacity. So changing up the colors here just to try some different things. In the end, we settled on this kind of brighter blue color here with the yellow supports, just to give it a little bit of a pop compared to the rest. And then now it's a bit of catch up on our handymen and all of that. We really haven't hired too many. I tend to only bring on one handyman until partway through the build, just because I don't want to spend a lot of money, and typically it's relatively easy to keep up with stuff, but as you get more things, you do need the staff to take care of it. So we're still going to try and go as minimal as possible and do that. So now we are looking to put back some of the rides that we removed, and in that case it was a carousel for a moment there, but then realized that maybe we'd actually prefer to put something else in that space, which we will here a little bit later. There's our water source with the fountain there, and our second drop tower on this side that we will kind of move around again and reposition and reorient. So at this point, once again, it's still more of a temporary build more than anything else, just to get ourselves the cash that we need to get going, and then after that we'll continue along a little further. So I've cut out quite a lot of the kind of general planning, because there's really not too much to see when you go into the time lapse, because it's just the mouse cursor moving about. But we spent a lot of time on this map, and it took quite a long time to get what we were looking for on this. But here we finally see the start of this chasm here, little canyon. So trying to lower this whole section. So I'm using the see-through sidewalls and the see-through landscape, which is H and J, by the way, on your keyboard if you want a shortcut for it. So this starts to get this thing pulled out, so we can kind of start to see where we're coming from. The downside for this is that we are reducing the usable area of the top of our rock, because we're removing top of the rock, I suppose. But at the same time, this also adds in some interesting interaction stuff and lets us do a bit more unique of a design. I said through this entire build that the theme and the motto of this build was trust the process, and I had to kind of remind myself that sometimes, because we were sort of just making a mess, it felt like, in a lot of cases. And after a while you just kind of had to remind yourself, okay, I have an idea in my head, I think we can execute this, and let's just try and see where we can get with it. So that was the idea, trust the process, and I will remind you of that as you watch this video too, because the end of this first episode, it's still going to look a mess. But we will start to be turning the corner just after that one, and then next episode is going to be all of just cleaning up and making the thing look alright. And I will say I'm pretty happy with how this one turned out in the end. It's a bit of a weird design, but it turned out okay, I think. But you guys be the judge for sure. So we've got our Ferris wheel there up on the hillside, second Ferris wheel, but the other one's just there to take some guests at the moment and bring us in a little bit of money. But the idea is that I want those kind of view type rides sitting up on the hillside there. So that's what we're going to do with the carousel, or not the carousel, the Ferris wheel. I feel like I messed that up pretty much every video. But we are now in the process of just trying to dig these things out from where they are. I did level it out partway through. I could have just gone continuous all the way, but I like to have the pylons, and until you go from level to slope in either up or down direction, or you do one of the turns that they have as an option for the sky rides, you don't get a pylon. And I wanted to have at least a pylon in this build, so we went flat for a minute, went a couple of extra spaces, and then went up again. So it was just enough to make the whole thing fit into the space that we had, and I think it looks alright, even though you're really not going to see those too much for this whole thing. But there we go, we have ourselves a nice little build, and starting to get the idea of what that might look like. Now, here is where I was going to put the carousel at one point, but ended up putting the top spin, trying to see how it fit in there. Ideally, it would be nestled in there a little bit closer, but there just wasn't the room to do it. So we stuck it as close as we could get to it and called it a day. So now it's just trying to figure out where the rest of the stuff is going to go. And we can see we're already relatively filled up into our map. Granted, there's still a lot of in-betweens that we can work through, but we can be quite a lot more efficient here as we go along too, and you can see we're starting to move some things temporarily. Now we're really getting into the temporary stuff where we're putting it down at the bottom of the mountain as we clear out some of the stuff for future builds. But we're already nearly at the goal too. We've got 700 something guests, and we're partway through year 2, so we got to get to year 4. So really, the guest count on this one is not a challenge. This is not a hard scenario, which is kind of funny since it's the very last one of the series. So it's not a hard scenario at all, but the location can make it a little bit difficult. All right, so here we go. Big coaster number 2, and for anybody who knows their coasters, you probably already see what I'm doing here. This is the famous Rattler Helix that was on Six Flags Fiesta Texas's Rattler coaster. This was an RCCA coaster that lasted up until it got reworked by RMC to Iron Rattler. And one of the big iconic features of the thing, and if you're not familiar with Six Flags Fiesta Texas, is the whole park sits inside of an old mine. So there's a bunch of vertical cliffs around, say, 3 sides of the park. So we're kind of in reverse on this one, where the whole thing sits on top of the cliff. But on the real one, it had this big helix that sort of undulated around and was kind of pointless and went just all over the thing, or all over the top of the hillside. Just kind of went up and down and up and down and up and down as it went around 3 whole times. So in homage to that, we are going to go ahead and do something of that nature. So we're started in the middle, which is not uncommon for our builds, and trying to kind of work our way through. And this is really where we get into the whole trust the process mentality, because there is a lot of stuff to build here. We are currently conflicting with the junior coaster, so I am going to take a quick exception here, 0 clearance, through that just to at least build this and kind of see where we land. So the challenge we run into is we have this giant structure, and I don't love having wooden coaster structure this tall, which means that we're going to have to eventually do some work there. But this is the overall idea here, so you can kind of see where we're going, where we have this big drop and climb up into that helix, and now we're building backwards from that drop. So the idea here is that we're going to have this diagonal climb, and then we're going to have another big drop, and that big drop is going to come down through the helix to start the ride. So that's the idea, but in order to execute that idea, we've got to move a whole bunch of stuff. So you can see now we're building a temporary pathway to go ahead and clear out the original one, which I was a little bit sad about because the original pathway is kind of cool. It's got not near enough landings on it to make it interesting, or to make it, I guess, what I would feel more realistic. But that said, I do really like the look of it. I kind of like the in and the out of the tunnel and things like that. So we'll do our best to bring back that vibe when we eventually build our final climb up to it. But that will be in the next episode. For now, we're just trying to carve out another section of this mountain so we can get this diagonal drop through the thing. Since we can't enter or exit a tunnel on the diagonal, and we don't want to do the whole thing in a tunnel, that means we got to put a canyon once again. So I did my best to chop up the video here a little bit so you're not kind of sitting at us trying to wait around and make some money, but you're instead just seeing the sections here that we cut out. We're not dropping all the way down to the bottom like we did on the dive coaster, just because it's already big enough, and I don't really want to spend too much time and effort trying to deal with such a larger coaster, because it's already a pretty big ride, and we're going to end up dealing with some pacing issues too once it gets back up onto the top. So for right now, what we want to do is just go ahead and use what feels like an appropriate amount of height for it. I mean, this, from an RCT standpoint, this is a monster wooden coaster, so I think I'm okay with that. We want to stick around this kind of scale in general. Usually, I don't want to go more than, say, 3 of the steep pieces as one of my drops, but in this instance, we're at like 5 or 6. It's pretty huge, as it turns out. So once again, we're going to get to the top of our hill and just build ourselves a station, and now we can at least test the ride and see whether or not it's going to fit. And as it turns out, we are not fast enough. So that is a twofold fix. So thing number one is to level this out a little bit earlier and lower that whole helix. And step number two is going to be to raise the first drop just a little bit. We don't want to make it too big because we still got to get a lift hill in there and everything. So that's a consideration as we go through. But at least lowering the helix is going to get us started there. So now we can see a little drop here, stretch out that big element there, and we're up on top. We don't need this helix to be fast. We don't want this helix to be fast. So this feels pretty alright for kind of where we are so far. As we clear out each of the rides up top, I'm just dumping them down at the bottom, knowing that we are going to have to come back through and do a little bit of adjustment at a later time to get the whole thing to fix. So you can see here we're moving over the drop tower, and eventually we're going to get rid of this thing entirely, temporarily. We will indeed bring it back. But it at least gets us some money while we are sitting here in the meantime. Even if I got to move it for 5 minutes, it's still better than just deleting the whole thing and leaving it. I want the whole thing to continue to make some funding, because while we are getting pretty good money now from the dive coaster, it's not quite enough to really get us cruising without having to stop for waiting for funds. So I don't want to eliminate that if I can avoid it. So now we're in the section here of trying to get this thing back, and it's a fairly short coaster so far, because really you've got the lift hill, the drop, the climb into the first element, which is really a turnaround into a drop, and then you've got the big helix, and that's about it. Now, original Rattler was actually fairly long. Part of that was because the helix itself was just so long, but the rest of the ride did have a fairly large component to it. So I feel like I need at least a mini drop off the mountain one more time. So we're going to do that in some instance, and I've left all of my iterations in here just so you can kind of see where we are. And you can see some of the pacing issues. Remember, this video is sped up by 4 times, so when the thing looks like it's at maybe a normal slower pace, it means it's really slow in real life, or in regular speed. So that's something to consider, and you can kind of see here we're waiting to see how the ride goes, and it doesn't do too badly there, but it just doesn't quite have the same oomph that we want it to. Initially, I had this diagonal lift hill in here, and that was the idea, and it was just long enough that we could go and still fit it onto the map and land it up top. But of course, the challenge is we got to get up to that elevation, so that's a plus 20, and we're coming up off this helix or turnaround at only a plus 18. I don't really want a second lift hill just because the ride is so short that it just feels like a little bit of bad design at that point. And granted, there are plenty of real life situations where that's a totally viable option, and in a situation like this, depending on who might be making this type of ride, that's a fully possible idea, but I just personally didn't want to do it. So we are going to keep trying a couple different things here just from a speed of execution standpoint, because obviously the clock is ticking each one of these times that we are building this. So I want to make sure that we get this thing done after a while. So eventually I've got to just be satisfied with something, and that's kind of where we're headed to at the moment. I'm going to raise the whole thing just one more time, and then we're going to come across okay, maybe it doesn't need to be diagonal, and we can set it up right alongside the back of that hillside that has the Ferris wheel on it. And that actually works pretty well, goes up over top of the water there. Now I can stick in a station here just to see how the whole thing runs with the newer, reworked hill. And we can dive off of the whole cliff right here, and it doesn't need to be a big drop, it's just enough to do a little bit there, and you can see it's just a little too slow, and that's okay. We can adjust that and make it work. I do want to have that up and down of pacing, because that's part of the interesting thing to me, is making sure that we play with that speed management through the whole thing. And now I can get this to adjust right up to the side where we are adjacent to the lift hill. The challenge is we really need to climb once into the brakes, and that's it, because it's not going to have the speed to do too much more beyond that. And we're at what I would consider an appropriate length of ride right now. So the idea is we'll bring the lift hill down to that overall height. So now we're where we need to be. We know that the train can make it back, so now it's just a matter of fitting the whole thing in. And by doing that, we are once again going to need to rework what goes where, and that means a new drop tower in a new spot. So we will bid farewell to this drop tower. This probably should have a count of how many times we deleted those towers, but they are gone now, and we're going to go through here and remove all of this queue and everything else and put all that back. You'll notice we finally stuck an exit on that one chairlift there. I don't know if any of you guys picked up on that watching the first part of the video, because we actually went quite a long way without having a connection to that exit. And because of the slope of the land, we were sending guests into the void for like 3 years of build. So I don't know how many guests we removed as part of that one, but definitely probably impacted our build just a little bit. Since we are going so slowly at the end, we don't need a huge brake run, so we're just going to stick with this kind of single one here that's just slightly longer than the train itself. And I am going to lower these two skyride stations here just so we can get some clearance here from the exit of the wooden coaster. So you can see here that exit can go across like a nice little bridge there. That was sort of an interesting thought. I was kind of thinking from an interaction standpoint that could be alright. So now we'll go ahead and give our 2 trains, jack up our price here. So between this and the dive coaster, the hope is that these 2 big coasters will fund the rest of our build, because those are it in terms of the big coasters. We will do one more smaller one still, but this is pretty much all that's going to easily fit onto the space. I'm sure we could have added some more, but we did want to spend time on making a good looking space. And now that this wooden coaster is complete, we are really at the point where now we turn the corner and we can kind of start cleaning stuff up and making it work for our advantage. So we've got this whole area in the back here that we can bring a pathway across, and we can do some work there. We need to address some guest issues here with all the pathways and the throw up and everything, but that will come here in a little bit as well. You can kind of see the effort here to start to adjust this, and that's part of pulling this land down to get ourselves a little bit of a smoother transition for things. So we'll bring in some rock here. We'll get all those lost guests solved at some point. So now we can bring in our towers in their final home, and I like the towers sitting kind of at the edge of the cliff here. I want to do the 2 arrangement, but I don't ever put them exactly side by side. You put them slightly off center just a little bit like this, so then you have that great bit of grid breaking look and feel. Build ourselves a little plaza here because we haven't really done too much of that so far, and we can start to create those gathering points and nodes within our park. Then we'll connect our first queue there, and then we can connect our second queue. And now we've got our first kind of permanent area here up at the top. So we've got that little pathway on the side of the hill that we built initially that really wasn't connected to anything. It's now connected to something. The pathway layout is horrendous because it doesn't loop around, so there's really not a good way to get to any of this kind of stuff, and it would not shock me if all of the guests are lost. But we will go ahead and fix that here as we move along. I'm not too worried about it in the immediate term, just because the guests aren't going to totally tank your park rating that quickly, and park rating is very easy to get back up and running when you need to do it. So starting to terrace this a little bit, we'll put in our scrambler and raise that up just a little bit and kind of start to bring those pathways up a bit higher. Another bit of plaza there as well. Also try and introduce some greenery here with that hedge fencing and some of the landscaping with the bushes. We will introduce a lot more greenery here as we move forward and continue that look and feel. So now I made the decision to move the Ferris wheel, which initially I was going to put an observation tower over here on the side, but in this instance I'm going to actually move the carousel over to, or not the carousel, gosh, I do that every single time. We're going to move the carousel over to here and the Ferris wheel. We're going to make a t-shirt for that maybe. But the Ferris wheel is going to go over there in the side, and the observation tower will go here. Now it is blocked by that one launch tower, but we are going to remove that launch tower here in just a minute and go ahead and clean this up just a little bit. So there we are. We've got our 2 nice viewing rides. and we can clean those up and fix this whole thing into place, and it's looking good. So this is going to about do us here for episode number 1. Hopefully you enjoyed this, and hopefully you're trusting the process, because I promise it's going to look more interesting and a little more cohesive once we get to part number 2. So stick around, because that is on the way, and let me know what you think of this one and where you think it's going to go. And until next time, we'll talk to you later on. Bye now.